Welcome to part 2 of this tutorial with focus on building a temporary access application. In order to continue with this part of the tutorial, you will have had to complete part 1 where we began the build out of this workflow. We will continue on building this workflow out and add some more advanced workflow concepts like conditional lines, evaluating user data and business data in a line, escalations, loopback lines, and more. You will also learn how to format workflows for clarity and visibility. Finally, you will deploy the finished workflow to a K2 environment. Beginning here with step 7, we will add conditional line rules and user tasks to the workflow, which will lay out the HR and IT tasks. These tasks will be executed depending on whether the requester selected the additional HR tasks and/or the additional IT tasks options from the original submission form. This step illustrates how to implement a conditional parallel path in a workflow. You will need to have K2 Studio opened up to the temporary access applications workflow from the project we created in part 1 before moving forward. I'll give you a chance to pause the video here if you need a few seconds to do that. Okay, once you have that open, let's select the Activity Wizards pane over here on the left, and then drag and drop 2 activities into the workflow and position them as follows. Just below the approved activity to the right and left, this is going to set up the parallel path so that the workflow can take. Let's name the activities as follows. For this one, you can name it IT tasks. And this one over here on the right, you can name it HR tasks. Let's also draw 2 lines to connect the approved activity with the 2 new activities as shown here. You can right-click in the approved activity until you see the pencil and drag down into the IT and then the HR activities. Let's also label these lines accordingly. Remember, you can double-click on the line. I'll start with the left line and we'll set it to IT tasks required. And then over here on the right, we'll name this one HR tasks required. We're also going to have to configure each of these line rules so that they will only be followed if the requester selected these options when filling out the form. If you've had a chance to review this form, remember there were 2 checkboxes to follow each of these paths. Let's right-click the IT tasks required line first, select Properties from the context menu, and when the wizard opens up, to get into the rule setup, select the line rule icon here on the left, and let's click the Add button here to add a rule in. As we run through this, let's take time to configure this line rule for the first variable. Open the context browser for that entry item, and go into the Process Activity Data tab, open up Item References, select Temporary Access Request, and then select IT Tasks Required from the list here, and click the Add button. We're going to set the comparison operator to equals, and we'll set the second variable to true. That way, this path will be followed if the additional IT tasks required checkbox was selected on the form. We can click OK now, and your screen should look like mine at this point, so you can finish this up when you're ready. Next, we will set up the HR tasks line. Just like we did in the previous task, let's right-click on the HR tasks required line. We'll configure this line rule as follows if you go into the line rules section. Open up the context browser for the first variable, go into the Process Activity Data tab, open up Item References, drill down into Temporary Access Request, and select the additional HR tasks required field. We can click the Add button to add this in, set the comparison operator to equals. For the second variable, again, we will set this to true. This will also start the workflow down this path if the additional HR tasks required field is checked from the form. You can click OK and then finish. Just as a recap, we have set up 2 lines that will determine whether the workflow will fire off an IT task and an HR task, or both, depending on the options selected by the requester on the form. Next, we will add in the user tasks for both of these steps so that IT and HR can perform them. Speaking of those tasks, let's move on to set up the IT path first. by switching to the Event Wizards pane over here on the left. Then drag and drop a Smart Forms client event into the IT Tasks activity. You can click Next on the first page of the wizard that pops up. In the screen called Select Form and State, let's rename this event to Additional IT Tasks. Let's use the context browser from the ellipses button to locate and select the temporary access request form. We can do this by opening up the Smart Forms server group options, go down into K2 Learning, open up Temporary Access Application, select the form from here, and then click Add. Also on this window, let's change the state options to use an existing state. We can select the IT task state from this list, which will tell K2 to run the form with an IT-specific layout that was designed by the form developer. When you get that set up, you can click Next. And then we're going to move past the next few screens here since they are going to be configured the way we need them to be by default. You can click Next to skip over the Configure Item reference screen and skip over the Specify Form Parameter screen. Now, the screen for configuring the Open Worklist item should be configured correctly to open this worklist item when the form is initializing. You can click Next to continue here as well. And then skip over the Transfer Workflow Data to Form screen. And here we've come to the screen to configure the actions. Here we're going to add one action. Let's call it IT Tasks Completed. We can leave the rest of the settings alone. You can click OK and then Next. Leave the Action Display Settings page alone. We won't need to change anything here. Click Next again. Skip over the Transfer Form Data to Workflow screen. And we can skip over the Configure Outcome screen. That's set up the way we need it as well. Okay, now we're on the Destination User screen. Here we need to add a new destination user by clicking the Add button. Then let's use the Context Browser Ellipses button to select the user or group that will perform the IT tasks. In this sample, and since I'm on a K2 provided virtual machine, I'm going to use the Denalix Operations Active Directory group. However, you may need to select a different group or user if you are using your own environment for this tutorial. If so, you could actually select your own username here if you wanted to, so that the task is routed to you for testing purposes if you prefer. Let's open up the Groups option here in the user browser. Then we'll select the K2 grouping here to open it up. From inside this group, locate Denalix Operations, select it, and click the Add button. Upon setting this up, you should notice that the Type list box changes to Group automatically for you here. After seeing that, let's click Next. To save time, we're not going to send a notification for this task, so we can click Finish to complete the wizard. However, if you prefer, you can select the Notify option and customize the notification message. You can also come back to the activity later and add a custom notification. A reminder for these user tasks, if you do use groups as a destination, everyone in the destination group will receive this notification email. So be cautious if you're building this application in your own environment as to not flood email inboxes. To check on our progress here, we've basically added the IT task user step. Next, we're going to add the HR tasks user step following the similar procedure. I'm going to run through this a little bit faster this time with the assumption that you're familiar with how to do it. Feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to take your time though. For this next task, we're going to drag and drop a Smart Forms client event into the HR tasks activity, and then we'll move forward to configure the event. For the Select Form and State screen, let's call this Additional HR Tasks. And then for the form, you can select Temporary Access Request Form the same way we did it with the context browser before. We're going to use an existing state and set it to HR tasks. We can move on from here and skip past the Configure Item Reference screen. We'll skip the Specify Form Parameter screen. We will also skip past the Configure Open Worklist Item Rule screen and the Transfer Workflow Data to Form screen. For the Configure Actions screen, let's add an action called HR Tasks Completed. Once you've entered that in, click Next. And skip past the Action Display Settings screen. And the transfer form data to workflow screen, we can skip that one. We won't need to change anything on the outcome screen, and that'll move us into the destination user screen when we move on. Here, let's do the same thing. We're going to select a group from Active Directory. In this tutorial, we will use the Denalix Human Resources group for this one. However, again, you can use your own account if you're on your own machine in your own environment. You can move on from this screen. For task notification, we will skip this as well. You can finish out the wizard. Once you get this far, the activities in your workflow should look like my screen here. Let's save our work in K2 Studio. Quickly to review, in this step we defined conditional line rules to determine the flow of a workflow. In this example, the workflow will take either the IT path, the HR path, or both, depending on the options entered by the requester in the original form. To make this possible, we learned how to define a line rule to conditionally follow a path in the workflow, which is based on data instead of a user's task decision. In the next step, we will do some work to handle more of the parallel execution here. In other words, what happens if both HR and IT tasks were selected. We will also add a line to define what happens if neither of the HR or IT tasks were selected. For step 8, we will add a merge activity that will determine whether it needs to wait for IT tasks, HR tasks, or both to be completed. By doing this, we will be merging the IT and HR paths back together in the workflow. We will also add a line for the workflow to follow if neither the IT nor HR tasks were selected. When building workflows with parallel paths, you usually need to add a merge activity that has a rule which will prevent the activity from starting until all the preceding parallel paths have completed. Let's do this in this workflow by opening up the activity wizards here on the canvas on the left side. And we can add a new activity to the canvas just under the IT and HR tasks. Let's call it Extend Access by double-clicking on the default activity text. Now let's grab and drag the line arrows for the IT tasks completed activity and drop it down on this new activity. And we can also do the same thing for the HR tasks completed activity. This new activity is going to contain a user task so that the original requester can decide whether to extend the temporary access or not. Conveniently, it will also act as the merge activity if the IT tasks and HR tasks are performed in parallel. Moving on, we will also need to cater for cases where neither the additional HR tasks nor the additional IT task options were selected. We can do this by right-clicking on the approved activity any place where you see the pen pointer appear, then hold the mouse button down to draw a line that goes from the approved activity to the Extend Access activity. Let's clean this line up so it's a little bit more readable. Following my lead, let's move the start end of the line attached to the approved activity around to the right side of the box. Then we can move the arrow end on Extend Access also over to the right side of that box. For this new line, let's right-click on it and select the Pin Line menu option to add a draggable pin to the line. Upon seeing that pin appear, you can drag the line so that it loops out and around these other objects on the canvas. You may have to move the pin quickly at first to move it past the other objects. Again, this is the line that the workflow will follow if neither IT nor HR tasks were selected from the form. Once you get the line in place, make sure to double-click on it and set the label to neither IT nor HR. While doing that, let's talk about this line for a moment. As it currently stands, the workflow is going to follow this path every single time it comes out of the approved activity. We actually need to put some rules behind this path to prevent that from happening and make it work the way we want. Let's right-click this new line and select Properties. Go into the line rule option by selecting the arrow icon on the left. Let's add a new line rule as follows. For the first variable, click the ellipses button to open up the context browser, and then go into the Process Activity Data tab. From here, we need to open up Item Reference, Temporary Access Request, select the Additional HR Tasks Required field from this list, and click the Add button. Let's change the comparison operator to the equal sign and enter the word false for the second variable. From here, you can click OK. Let's add another line rule as follows. Click the Add button. On this window, let's select AND for the Boolean operator. The first variable will be populated from the item reference in the context browser again. Let's drill into temporary access request and select additional IT tasks required this time. Make sure you get the one called IT since the previous line rule evaluates the HR value. We can set the comparison operator to equals again, false for the second variable, and click OK to close this out. At this point, your screen should look like mine with the line rule definitions here. To talk about the logic here again, we added a line that will be followed if the requester neither selects the additional IT tasks nor the additional HR task options. We had to do this because otherwise the workflow would end after the approved step. This is because the two existing lines would only be followed if either the IT tasks or HR tasks or both options were selected. At that point, there was no other way out of that activity. Next, we will configure the extend access task to only run when both IT tasks and HR tasks are complete. This is a requirement when you want to implement a parallel path in a workflow. Otherwise, the extend access task would start once right after the IT tasks are complete and once again when the HR tasks are complete. And we don't want to duplicate the steps following those. We will be adding a preceding rule to the extend access task so that it checks to make sure that both IT tasks and HR tasks are complete before the extend access task is started. To do this, right-click the extend access step and select Properties. Go into the Preceding Rule tab here on the left of the dialog and click Add. We can configure the rule as follows. Click the ellipses button for the first variable to open up the context browser. Then go under Item References in the Process Activity Data tab to open up Temporary Access Request. Select Additional HR Tasks Required and click the Add button. When you get that added in, set the logical operator to equals. For second variable, enter in the word false. Click OK when you fill that in. And next, click the Add button again. Set the Boolean operator to AND. For the first variable, this time we're going back into the item reference for temporary access request to open up that group if it's not already. This time, select Additional IT Tasks Required and click the Add button. Again, comparison operator can be set to equal. Enter in false for the second variable and click OK. At this point, your screen should look like mine. Be sure that you're using both the additional HR tasks required and additional IT task required references here. You can click Finish when you're ready. Let's do a quick recap at this point. We set up the preceding rule so that the extend access activity will only start if both IT task and HR tasks are not required. There is one more thing we have to do to make this work. When the IT tasks are completed, we need to set the additional IT tasks to false, and also when the HR tasks are completed, we need to set that field to false. We will do this by calling the temporary access request smart object and updating these properties once the respective tasks are completed. Let's copy and paste the set status approved event into the IT tasks and HR tasks activities. As you do this, make sure that the event is copied underneath the existing user tasks that are there as shown on my screen. We can rename these events. For the one on the left under IT, set it to IT Tasks Complete. You can double click on the text. And then we'll set the HR side to Set HR Tasks Complete. When you get those renamed, let's run the wizard for the copied Set IT Tasks Complete event by hovering over the event and click on the shortcut box that appears here on the right. Click Next until you get down into the input mapping window. We need to set the value of the additional IT tasks required property to false. You can do that here and click Finish to complete the wizard. You can leave all the other properties as they are. Let's do this for the copied Set HR Tasks Complete event as well. We'll drill in and set the additional HR tasks required property to false. Click Finish to complete this wizard. Also, you can leave the other properties alone. That's all we need to do for this particular step. Let's save the workflow before we go on, as we don't want to lose all this work. In review, we needed to add a line that will be followed if neither IT nor HR tasks are required. This way, the workflow will ultimately arrive at the extend access step regardless of the options selected by that requester. We also needed some way to tell the extend access step to wait for both IT tasks and HR tasks to be completed before it starts. We accomplished this by setting the value of the additional IT tasks required and additional HR tasks required to false after those respective tasks are completed. This will now allow for all combinations of IT tasks and HR tasks to be selected or unselected. What is important to note here is that for a parallel workflow to merge again later on, we needed to define a preceding rule for the merging activity to wait for all paths of that parallel workflow to complete before it moves on. For step 9, we will add a workflow step for the requester to decide whether or not the temporary access should be extended. This will include adding a client event with a start rule, an escalation, and a loopback line. Let's say we have a contractor on site with a project that may be lasting longer than anticipated, and therefore the temporary user needs access to the system or site for longer. The extend access step handles this in our workflow, but we need it to start one day before the temporary access is due to expire. This is to prevent adding a task to the requester's work list until it is actually necessary to extend the access. As a security measure, we also want this task to expire and the temporary access to expire. That is, if the requester forgets to action the task by one day after the end date of the access request. We can set this up in our workflow. First, we will add the rule that delays the start of the extend access step until one day before the access end date. To get started, right-click the extend access activity and select Properties. Now, select the Start Rule tab within here. Then click on the Start option to enable it instead of Start Immediately. Expand the context browser on the right of the window by clicking on the arrow on the edge here. We're going to do this because we want to use one of the date functions to help us in this next task. Open the Inline Functions tab. Then break open the Date and Time group of functions. Locate and drag and drop the Add Days function into the Date text box. For the days value, type in -1. When you get that entered, open up the Process Activity Data tab and go into the Item References group. From within here, open up Temporary Access Request and drag the End Date property into the Date Time Value text box, as I demonstrate here, and then click Finish. Click Finish once again to close the Extend Access Properties wizard. Just as a recap, we just defined a rule so that the Extend Access activity will start one day before the end date that was originally entered by the requester, hence the -1 for the day's value. We want this task to be presided over by a user, so next we will add the user task to this activity and configure the lines that result from it. Drag and drop a SmartForms client event into the Extend Access activity from the Event Wizards pane over here on the left. You can click Next on the Wizard Welcome page. As we've done for the IT and HR tasks activity, we should be fairly familiar enough with the SmartForms client event wizards. I'll trust that you know where you're going, so I'm going to go through this a little faster. For the Select Form and State screen, let's name this Extend Temporary Access. For the form, drill in to the context browser and locate the Temporary Access Request form. For its state, we're going to use the extend state. We can click Next at this point to move on, and we can skip over the Configure Item Reference screen, move past the Specify Form Parameter screen, Also, we don't need to make any changes to the screen for configuring open work list item rules, so move on past that, and move on past the transfer workflow data to form screen. That should lead us to the configure actions screen. Here, let's add an action to extend access. You can enter it in as I show you here. And then we will enter in another action that states do not extend access. When you're ready with that, you can move on and also skip over the action display settings. You can skip past transfer form data to workflow, skip past outcomes. For the destination user screen, let's select the process instances originator from the workflow context tab. I'll show you how to find that here. And then when you're ready, you can move on. For task notification, to speed up the demo, we're going to skip past that. We can close out the wizard and we should be done. At this point, you should see two lines that flow out of the activity on the design canvas. Let's grab the arrow of the extend access line and loop it back to the same activity that it's coming out of. Give yourself some time here. It may take a few tries before the arrow will snap back to the extend activity. As you're working on that, I'd like to discuss something to warn you about. As a best practice from K2, we recommend that you do not draw lines that loop back to activities that contain only server events if those activities do not have a start date that increments somehow. Doing this will result in an unresponsive process at runtime and can affect the performance of your K2 environment. This is because your workflow could end up going into an infinite loop. You should only use this loopback line approach with activities that contain user tasks. This is because the workflow will wait for the user to action their task. Or you can do it with activities that have a start rule because the start rule will delay the start of the activity until a certain date, which will prevent the loop from putting your workflow into an infinite running state. Let's flip back to the Activity Wizards group in K2 Studio and add a new activity called Set Status Expired. We'll add this to the workflow down at the bottom of the canvas. And then you can hook the Do Not Extend Access line to this new activity. At this point, we also want to define the escalation for the Extend Access step. This is so that the workflow will go to the Set Status Expired activity automatically 1 day after the end date of the access request. This is a security measure just in case the requester forgets to action the task to extend the temporary access. We don't want to extend it by accident. Right-click the Extend Access activity again and select Properties. Then open the Escalations tab. You should notice this is the tab with only the clock icon on it just above the exception triangle icon. On this window, add a new escalation. Click Next on the escalation home screen to get into the General Properties screen. Let's name this escalation Expire Access and click Next. This brings us to the Rule Template screen. Here, let's select Escalate On and click Next. This is where our security measure comes into play. We want this escalation to fire 1 day after the end date. Within the Escalate On screen, select the Dynamic Radio button option, and then use the ellipses icon to drag and drop the Add Days inline function into the Date and Time text box. You can find that in the Inline Functions tab under the Date and Time group of functions. Let's configure this function to add a day to the end date property found under Item References in the context browser, and it should be under the Temporary Access Request group. You can click Finish when you're ready. Click Next to go to the Working Hour screen and select the None Radio button option. This escalation doesn't have to rely on a particular time zone of set working hours based on how it's going to work. Now let's click Next to go into the Action Template screen. For the action template, select Go To Activity and click Next. On the Go To Action screen, select Set Status Expired and click Next again. And let's click Finish to complete the escalation wizard. Then click Finish to close the Activity Properties page. Let's save our work again at K2 Studio, and then we'll do a quick review. In this step, we configured a user task with a start rule. This is so that the task is delayed until a specific date is reached. And then we added an outcome that loops back to the same activity so that the task is restarted on a later date if the user decided to extend access. We also added an escalation that will expire the active task and go to another activity in the workflow if the user does not action the task in time. We used inline functions to calculate the start date and escalation date for these activities. In our scenario, this step is used so that the requester can extend the temporary access if needed, but if they forget to do so, the system will automatically expire the temporary access 1 day after the end date for security purposes. In step 10, we will add some additional server tasks that need to be performed to complete the workflow. One task will update the status of the temporary access request, and another will disable the Active Directory account that was created for the temporary user. We will also define a conditional line so that the account is only disabled if an account was created. Let's get started by again copying the setStatusApproved event from up here and pasting it into the setStatusExpired activity. Once you've done that, let's rename this event by double-clicking on the text and call it setStatusExpired. Hover over the event and rerun the event wizard. This is where we're going to configure this event to set the status property to the word expired. When the wizard opens up, go down into the input mapping window, find the status property, and assign it this value. When you get that entered in, you can finish the wizard. Next, we're going to add a new activity to this workflow by getting the blank activity from the Activity Wizards group over here on the left side of K2 Studio. Drop it on the canvas just below the setStatusExpired activity. Double-click its title and rename it to Disable AD Account. Now, let's go back to the events grouping in K2 Studio over here on the left. Drag and drop an Active Directory event into the Disable AD Account activity that we just put on the canvas. You can click Next on the wizard's home screen. Let's name this event Disable User Account. Then select the Disable User action here from this list of options and click Next. Here on the screen called Specify a User to Disable, we want to drag and drop the trim inline function into the username. Again, this is because the Disable a User method is going to be specific about trailing and leading spaces on whatever value we put in. We can configure this function to use the item references temporary access request AD username property from the context browser. This is the value that we will focus on. Click Finish when you're ready. Then click Finish on the Specify a User to Disable screen to complete the wizard. To recap what we just did, we added an event that will disable the account of the temporary user. We did this by using the AD username property from the form that was filled in to find the correct account. Next, we are going to add a line to the workflow that will only go to this activity if an account was actually created for the temporary user. Let's draw a line between the setStatusExpired activity and the Disabled AD Account activity. Right-click this new line, select Properties, and click the Line Rule Properties tab over here on the left. We're going to add a new rule to this line and configure it so that the line is only followed if the AD login required property from the form was filled in and set to true. Follow along as I dig into the context browser to get this field and finish out the wizard. You can go into the context browser, open up item references, and select temporary access request. Grab the AD login required property and click Add. For the comparison operator, select equals. And then for the second variable, enter in the word true and click OK. And you can click Finish when you're done to close the line properties window. Let's add a line label to this line that indicates that it will only be followed if the created account value is set to true. I'll enter in AD account requested for this line label. At this point, your workflow should look something like mine on the screen. Let's save this to preserve what we just did. To quickly review, in this step, we added a smart object method to set the status of the request to expired. We also added a new event to disable the Active Directory account and configured a line rule so that the account is only going to be disabled if an actual account was created for the temporary user. In step 11, we will take time to format the workflow by changing the color scheme and layout of the activities on the workflow design canvas in K2 Studio. Make a note, this is going to be an optional step. Formatting the layout of the workflow will not change the behavior of the workflow, it will just make it easier to read on the design canvas. If you are short on time, feel free to skip ahead to step 12. First, we will change the color of all user activities to blue on this workflow. This will make it so we can easily distinguish activities that require user input from activities that are performed by the K2 server only. Let's start off by right-clicking the approval activity, select the Change Color option from the menu, and change the color of this activity to blue. You can see what that looks like on my screen here. Now let's use the same approach to change the color of the IT Tasks activity. And that looks good. Let's go over and change the HR Tasks activity. And then finally, we can move down and change the Extend Access activity to blue. At this point, as I scroll up and down, you can see it's now much easier to see which tasks in the workflow require user action. You can also use color coding to illustrate the different paths that may be followed in the workflow. For example, you can illustrate the exception path. Let's do that by right-clicking the rejected line, and we can change its color to red to indicate that this is the exception. While we're changing the lines, let's go over and change the color of the loopback extend access line to orange. This is going to indicate that this is an optional path. And then we can change the color of the IT tasks required and HR tasks required lines to purple. This will indicate that they are both parallel paths. As we do this, you can make the color scheme whatever you would like it to be in your own organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be what we do in this tutorial. Finally, if necessary, you can move activities around and you can use the alignment functions in K2 Studio in the top menu so that activities are nicely aligned and separated from one another. Try not to have any activities overlap and try to lay the workflow out so that lines do not cross over each other on the view. It won't affect the operation of the workflow, as I mentioned earlier, if they do overlap, but following these guidelines just makes for an easy-to-understand workflow, and it improves the ability for others in your organization to support this application. When you're done, the workflow should look something like this. Go ahead and save your work again. In review, we just explored some of the formatting options for workflows. Applying some consistent and logical formatting language to a workflow will make it easier to understand. In our final step of part 2, which is step 12, we will briefly explore and configure process properties, deploy the workflow to our K2 environment, and then give the users in our organization permission to start and report on the workflow. As we get started with this step in the tutorial, we need to make sure that the workflow will generate reporting smart objects when it is deployed. We will be using these smart objects in future sections of this tutorial. Right-click anywhere in the canvas of the workflow in K2 Studio and select Properties. Then you can open the Association tab here and confirm that the Create Workflow Reporting Smart Objects option is selected. Select it if necessary. In my case, I do need to select it. If you do as well, be sure to go into the Settings area for this and put a check in all options here. Click OK, and then finish the wizard. When you're ready, go up to the Deployment pane in the ribbon menu and select Deploy. You may need to wait for the project compilation to finish. This may take a few seconds. Feel free to pause the video here if you need to. When that's done, on the Deployment Wizard home screen, click Next. In the Server and Project Settings screen, let's select to deploy this workflow to the development environment. Then click Next. Click Finish to start deploying the workflow. Again, this may take a few seconds for the workflow to finish deploying. At this point, I'll pause the video for the sake of time. Okay, once the deployment is done on your environment, you should see a deployment succeeded message in the toolbar. At this point, let's take a moment to save our work for this workflow in K2 Studio. And now we need to go over to K2 Workspace and give all of the users in our domain the rights they need to start this new workflow and view workflow reports. Now, if the K2 Workspace link is not automatically on your machine, you may need to ask your K2 administrator for the URL to your workspace. If you do not have admin rights on your K2 environment, your K2 administrator will need to assign the process rights described in the following steps. Let's go and launch K2 Workspace. If you're on a K2 provided virtual machine, go down to the Start button, select All Programs, open up K2 Black Pearl, and select K2 Black Pearl Workspace from the options. You may also have this shortcut in other areas on the virtual machine. When it opens up, navigate to the Management Console by moving the mouse over the Management menu option at the top and select the Console option. When the Management Console opens, let's browse to the permissions for this newly deployed workflow. You can break open the K2 server tree here, then open up Workflow Server, drill down into Processes, and from these categories, open up K2 Learning Temporary Access Application, and open up Temporary Access Application Workflow. Inside here, select Process Rights. To add some new permissions, click on the Add button to start. Then in the search box that appears here, search for Domain Users. Once the group shows up in the search results list, select this group and click OK. On the permission screen, you can select the Start and View permission, and then click Save. Once you've done that, you should see that the deploying user has admin rights on the workflow, and domain users have start and view rights for this workflow. You can leave Workspace open since we will be using it in the next part of this tutorial to run reports. In this step, we review the process properties, specifically ensuring that K2 will create reporting smart objects for this workflow. We also had the chance to deploy this workflow to our environment in development, and then we set permissions so that the users in our domain can start the workflow and run reports against this workflow. This is all we'll be doing to build this workflow out, so at this point we've reached the end of part 2. We hope you've gained a better understanding on how some of the more advanced options and best practices work when building out K2 workflows using K2 Studio. In this part of the tutorial, we learned how to implement more advanced workflow concepts like conditional lines, evaluating user data and business data in a line, escalations, loopback lines, and more. We also learned how to format a workflow for clarity and then deploy the finished workflow to a K2 environment. When you're ready, you're welcome to move on to part 3 of this tutorial where we will test out this application.